Hello, Chris. Another week in AI. How are you doing?
Hey, Richard. It's good to see you. I'm doing excellent. I'm excited about a lot of the stories for today.
Yeah, so we're going to change things up a little bit. In the past, what we've done is we've covered these stories in detail as we talk about them at the end of the week. Essentially, it's a review of what you've seen on Maginative.com. What we're going to do from here on out is that instead of repeating the stories that are available on the website, we're just going to refer you back to the website to read those stories for yourself. And we're going to focus more on the conversation about why these things matter, have our opinions, get into the details of that. So the format of this will change slightly. You still have all your news on the Maginative website. You can subscribe and get the weekly review, which will be a highlight of all the top stories from the week. But from now on, we're going to use this podcast and this session as a way to dive deep into the bigger picture, the macro, and how it addresses or how it affects your life as a consumer or a business owner.
Excellent. I'm excited about that. Let's do it.
Yeah, so a couple of things to highlight there. Obviously, has been a significant amount of investment continuing in this space. We're actually going to start there. We're going to start with a conversation about money. We're going to have a conversation about some of the new devices that you can actually wear or carry around with you. Finally, we're starting to see AI cross that boundary from being just a technology that we hear about to being a technology we can touch and feel and actually see in a tangible way. Hence, I'm wearing glasses as a way to remind us that have that conversation. We're also going to talk about Adobe, dive a little bit deeper into their new feature set. Because we are product designers, because we are product creators, this is particularly interesting to us and our audience. So that's where we're going to start. Chris, what do we need to know about the money that's going into AI and the valuations that are connected to that? Because we've had quarterly results this week. Let's talk about money.
So this is mind-boggling what we're seeing. If you're an investor in companies in the AI space, or if you're a VC, if you're just a retail investor looking to capitalize on the AI industry, this was a week that you couldn't ignore, right? Like we had stories from Microsoft releasing their earnings, Alphabet releasing their earnings, and Meta. Intel also released their earnings with regards to their chips. And I want to start there because I think it's important to kind of dissect the results from the last quarter, but also the company's strategies in terms of how they're approaching AI. All right. So, kind of breaking it down, Meta released their earnings first, and they had a good quarter, but Mark Zuckerberg on the call spoke about their continued investment in AI and the fact that it was going to be super expensive for a long period of time before they're going to be able to realize the benefits of AI. And the
Mhm.
context here is, of course, that Meta is the darling child of the AI ecosystem because they are investing in open sourced AI and a lot of research. So they're putting in billions of dollars, giving that research away basically to the community. And there isn't a clear strategy as to how it's going to benefit them from a product standpoint, either now or down the road. Of course, they release product updates, but we're not seeing how that is translating to increases in advertising revenue or in engagement right now. Alphabet, sorry, and Microsoft, on the other hand, have decided to invest in AI infrastructure so they can sell their cloud services to people that want to use these models. And also, they have their proprietary models. Microsoft, through OpenAI, has GPT. And of course, Google has Gemini. Their earnings were amazing. Microsoft's revenue rose 17% to $61.9 billion. And of course, their cloud services have also grown like crazy. And so here we are thinking, well, how do you actually make money with AI? And you're seeing two different approaches, two different strategies. Yes, you can be an advocate for open source, but does that translate to actual profits for investors?
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, incredible amounts of money being made right now. I think a lot of what I would like to understand is it looks like, at least when you read these articles, when you see these stories, that most of this investment is going into infrastructure, so
Mhm.
chips,
Mhm.
fabs. I mean, there's a lot of infrastructure. It reminds me of 1997, 98, 99, when we were building, the infrastructure for the internet. These are investments that are not going to show a return for quite some time. Right? We're laying the tracks for the trains. It's going to be a while. even though Meta's got an open source strategy versus some of the closed product lines that we're seeing from the others, surely all of them are making investments in infrastructure right now. Surely all of them will have to wait and see whether this big investment pays off.
Hmm. So I think you're right. However, at least with Microsoft and Alphabet, they're able to offset a lot of the expenses when it comes to investing in their AI by charging people to use their infrastructure. That's the benefit that they have as a business model, right? And
Mm.
so for a Meta, of course, they can release a model, but they have no way to actually make money from that. And it's interesting because Snowflake did something interesting this week also, right? Snowflake released an open sourced enterprise model called Arctic, and I believe they spent $2 million to build and train this model. And then again, they're giving it away for free. And the question is, how do you end up making money from this long term? I get that there's this appeal that you want it to be open and anyone can build on it. But is there a clear strategy that says, once I release this model, people will likely want to use my data platform in the case of Snowflake versus just taking it and running it on Google's infrastructure and Microsoft's infrastructure, and they end up being the ones to benefit. And I think this is a case where also Microsoft and Google can double dip, right? They can invest in the model providers like the GPT-4s and in even an Anthropic. And as people are using these models, and the model providers themselves have to rely on them for the infrastructure for training and inference. And so they're really well positioned versus companies that are going to need to create a product at the end of the day and not just leverage the technology.
Yeah, very interesting. Related to this, of course, is that now we're starting to, because of all the investment into infrastructure, we're starting to see a significant load on the energy grid and the energy providers. We're starting to see, we spoke about this last week, where Amazon have reportedly made an investment in a nuclear power plant. It sounds like if you want to be making money in this space, it's not just in the the making of products or the creating of models, but in also providing the underlying services that support that. You've already mentioned, AWS and Azure, these kinds of infrastructure supporting plays, but even a layer below that is the energy infrastructure that has to support that. We have an energy crisis, and now we're asking the grid to provide us with even more support for that. What can we do? How do we get over this energy hump, or is this something that we are just going to have to, is this going to be the bottleneck? Is energy going to be the bottleneck?
It definitely feels that way. And even when you talk to the leaders of a lot of these companies, Sam Altman at OpenAI, leaders at Microsoft, you're seeing not only are they expressing concerns in terms of infrastructure. I think Mark Zuckerberg was on a podcast earlier this week and he stressed that energy is going to be that bottleneck, right? You do see a lot of investments in alternative sources of energy and options where we can explore nuclear, we can have innovation in solar to figure out how we're going to exactly tackle this. But
Mm.
that has been always the question when you had all of the AI doomsday sayers saying, hey, you're going to have FOOM and AI is going to suddenly rise up and take over the world. The biggest thing that they ignored was the fact that AI needs energy. And so at
Right.
the end of the day, we would still need to figure out a way to create and provide all of this energy before we even reach to that stage. And so understanding that perspective, right, and what challenges we needed to tackle in the right timeline was important. And I think for now, we can put aside that future and say, okay, in the short term, we're heading barreling towards an energy crisis. And
Yeah.
how do we tackle that as a society? How do we ensure that we're not disproportionately affecting regions and countries and communities that won't benefit from AI right away?
Yeah, I mean, there's two things to consider here. One is, it feels like we've been here before. This feels like, the Germans invading Russia after Napoleon failed to do it in the winter. Like, oh yeah, we'll just do the same thing, and having exactly the same result. Crypto had exactly the same impact on the energy grid. There was clearly a bottleneck there, a massive lashback, like a backlash, I should say, from the community saying, wow, it's costing us even more to support this than it is to, get the benefits from it. So I think that's one aspect. The other thing that, I spoke to a CEO of an energy company this week.
Hmm.
They've got a renewable energy source and a platform that allows you to both manage and store your energy at the local level. And he said it's like riding the 100-foot wave, right?
Hmm.
This is it's uncharted territory. We just don't know what kind of expectations we'll be able to fulfill. But I think what was really interesting about that conversation was the amount of innovation that's led, that's pushing the energy space. So we spoke a little bit about nuclear. Nuclear is a clean energy, going back to that, kind of getting over the environmentalist hump, if you will, towards something that's, clearly renewable and also long-term value. But also the management of power, both at the battery level and the chip level, we're starting to see more innovation there. So in a way, the environmentalist part of me is irritated by this, and it kind of feels like I said, we've made this mistake before. We should have thought about this. But on
Yeah.
the other hand, we are seeing these pressures create significant innovation in the energy space, and the energy CEOs seem to be very excited about it. I'm going to actually be speaking to another venture capitalist in the energy space this coming week and see if we can dig up some more dirt on this.
Yeah, it's so fascinating because I remember in January, Sam Altman was at Davos, and he said clearly like the bottleneck is going to be energy, and unless we have a breakthrough with energy, we're going to ultimately hit a wall when it comes to innovation in AI. And you're seeing like this week there was a company called xAI. It's actually based in Miami, and that's amazing because the Miami AI scene and tech scene is really picking up steam. I'm excited to be down here. But Exawatt is innovating in solar, and they were able to
Mm.
raise $1 million in seed funding from Sam Altman, from Andreessen Horowitz. And so you're seeing this continued push for innovation in the space. And hopefully we'll get that breakthrough sooner than later. The one thing that we do know is that when you have that focused, concerted effort in a specific space, innovation happens faster, and that's something that I'm looking forward to.
Let's shift our attention to the well, I'll call it wearables for lack of a better word, but AI now becoming something that's a little bit more part of your day-to-day experience outside of the screen. We saw Rabbit, Humane, and also Meta uh, finally get the products that they've been talking about into the market. Let's talk about that. What should we be expecting? Is this just going to be one of those kind of like highly, um, how should we say, like exclusive type product experiences, like some of the wearables that we've seen from Apple and others? Is this going to be just like one of those kind of, oh, you have a cyber truck and a wearable, and you're a tech bro, or is this something that we can expect to see adopted across a much broader audience and maybe in some B2B or commercial applications as well?
So here's where we're at. I think people love the smartphone.
Actually, I disagree with that. I think maybe I think we used to love the smartphone. I think
Yeah.
there's a lot of evidence. I actually just read a report this week to say that smartphones are directly connected to. I think this is the 40th paper on depression
Mm.
associated with smartphones. Yeah, and I think in general, we all have a very much a love-hate relationship with our smartphones. So I'm not sure we all love them.
Yes, this is fair. So you're right. So and that's my point, right? Like I think we have come to this point where as a society we're starting to take a step back and acknowledge the really negative and devastating effects of having the screen with us all the time. And so you're seeing innovation starting to happen with companies trying to explore what ambient computing looks like, trying to explore what comes beyond the smartphone. And while I do think we'll always need to have a local device that will have the compute power to do some amount of processing, I do think investing in like watches and smart headphones, screenless devices could be really important. And so the first generation of these devices, like the Human AI Pin, the Rabbit R1, I think it's important to put them in context of any first and early generation product. It's not so much about whether or not they succeed or if they're going to completely change the game for wearable devices and AI devices for the foreseeable future. As much as it's an opportunity for us to ask questions, for us to explore, for us to experiment, and take the best of what they can offer and what they represent to the next set of products until ultimately we reach to a place where we can be happy. And so this week we saw a lot of reviews coming in for the Rabbit R1, and of course we last week we had Humane's AI Pin. And the obvious and expected consensus is that these devices aren't really ready for prime time, especially when you look at the cost, right? Like Humane's AI Pin was $699
Mm-hmm.
plus a $24 per month subscription cost.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you're thinking, well, if I have a phone and I'm going to now spend all of this money, it needs to differentiate itself and it needs to really work.
And just to be clear, these things only work if you have a phone with you, right? They
Exactly.
are tethered to your phone. So not only do you have to pay for the device, you also have to pay for your existing smartphone. And I think this is really important because this is a UX pattern that we've seen in the past, is that there is a non-substitution effect.
Hmm.
When you went out and bought your first tablet, you didn't throw your smartphone away. When
Yeah.
you went out and got, the next device, whatever that is, some kind of wearable, maybe it was a watch, maybe it was a Whoop, maybe it was something, all of those things had a non-substitution effect. So as predicted, I spoke about this at Harvard and MIT almost 10 years ago, is that we're not seeing these new devices replace the
Exactly.
existing devices. We're seeing them being either tethered to or augmented to existing devices. And I actually see that as a fundamental problem with new innovation. We have to get to the point where we can start to innovate around a net new space where, for example, an AI driven device can live on its own, because for $24 a month, I'm happy to pay that if I can get rid of my smartphone. But if I can't and I have to continually add new devices, there is a fatigue associated with that, a tech fatigue associated with that. So I think we have to be conscious as creators, as designers, as makers of things, that the substitution effect is something we haven't actually managed to achieve yet.
But here's my perspective. And I think it's not that I'm disagreeing with you, but I think it's too much to try to replace the smartphone in one go. And this is where Meta, I think, is succeeding. Rather than saying, hey, you know what, we're going to replace all of the smartphone, they're saying, can we create a device that adds enough value that you can do these things less on your phone and you can have this much more value being delivered from our device? And
Mm.
so they don't market their smart glasses as, oh, you'll never need to have your phone. They'll say, hey, rather than pulling out your phone, you can be present if you want to share a video. If you want to ask questions, you don't need to pull out your phone. The Meta AI assistant is right there. It can see what you're seeing. And so it's amplifying as and you talk about this a lot, it's giving you
Mm-hmm.
superpowers, right? And I think for companies that are working on AI devices, it's okay in the short term to say, you know what, the smartphone is here for the near future. Let's figure out what the phone can do really well and what an additional device could do even better, and how we can create an experience that improves what you already have if you only had a phone versus if you have a phone plus this device.
Yeah, I mean, look, this we're not going to solve this problem in this debate, because I think it's an existential problem with product creation in general. Again, we've spoken about this. There is an additive strategy built into almost every company right now, where they're trying to look at adding new things to take on new markets or add to new segments within their constituents. I fundamentally disagree with that. I think we should be in an era of subtraction, but it's very hard to have a subtractive mindset if your DNA in your organization is about additive, right? I think of Figma as a really good example. Figma have now achieved what they set out to achieve, and they've saturated the designer market. And so when they come out with a net new addition to this, in terms of something like dev mode, what they're saying is, we've saturated our designer market, and instead of us adding additional value to that designer market, we're going to go and do the slash or burn approach, which is we're going to go and cut down a new forest, which is the engineering market. But unfortunately, that product, that dev mode, isn't a satisfactory product for an engineer. Not only does the company lack the brand credibility to be able to go into that space, but they also lack a suitable product to replace the existing tool set that's out there. So you're not going to throw out your Confluence. So, you start using dev mode, or you're going to stop using GitHub because you're going to start using dev mode. Like, these things they're not well thought through from a strategy point of view, because their incentives are almost entirely driven by their venture partners, right? Their venture partners have said, if you want to see a 40% growth every year, you've got to go and find new markets to do that. This is essentially a slash and burn approach. It's like looking at a green field and saying, look, we're just going to go and take what we can. And I think there's something fundamentally wrong with that. And that's why we run into the issues that we do. I think growth at all costs is the message underneath that, which is the problem. And so when I look at these devices, when I look at Rabbit and Humane, I see opportunities to create a substitution effect that hasn't been really, really leveraged yet. And I'd like to see a company come along and say, yes, we can build on existing infrastructure, but we don't necessarily have to tether it to your existing devices. There is an opportunity to create a generation. I'd love my children to grow up in a generation where there isn't a screen. They're not looking at their phone all the time. I mean, you walk out into the city and you just see people staring at their screens all day. This is hopefully a temporary stage. I hope that we are just in a temporary disruption where we're all looking at our screens, and that isn't going to be the case in our children's generation.
That's why I think I'm very excited about what Meta is doing with their Ray-Ban smart glasses. So this week, they released multimodal updates. They have their Meta AI, which is now running their open source Llama 3 model on
Mm-hmm.
device.
Mm-hmm.
And what you're able to do is put on these glasses that are very stylish, by the way. You have three new styles: Wayfarer, Skylar, Headliner, and they have an exclusive style with Ferrari that's going to be coming out later this month, I believe, or next month. But one, it means that people can wear these and feel comfortable. It doesn't feel like you're putting technology on your face. But
Right.
it also means that maybe there's a future where this could just be paired with a smartwatch. And you
Right.
can have a number associated with your smartwatch. So that allows you to not feel like you're giving up your phone and your number, but it allows you to be more present. And you can still
Yeah.
capture video just like you would with a camera on your phone, but it allows you to be more present. And so I do think that approach could be a winning approach. My prediction is that every consumer device company today that makes a smartphone is going to have a smart glasses.
Yeah, I think you're right. One of the other UX patterns here to be conscious of is the fact that people still are emotional and feeling based individuals, right? As rational as we are, and we may say, hey, this device provides me with some kind of superpower, technology superpower, we still have to interact with each other. And
Yeah.
I think I'm paraphrasing Prof. Galloway when he said the easiest way to signal that you're a 40-year-old virgin is to walk around town with your headset on, right? And I think that's actually, probably an extreme perspective, but I don't think that that's far off, in the sense that what we've seen is that the technology is created by a lot of folks who are not necessarily thinking about fashion or the subjectivity of the individual identity. Like, how do I present myself? What do I think of who I am through the expression of the clothes that I wear and the things that I put on my face? And I think that's important. I think Apple did it really well. I think they've always done a good job of that. I think
Mm.
Ray-Ban and Meta are doing an exceptional job at that. I'd like to see more of that. I actually, as a consumer, more than a technologist, I'd like to see more of that. I'd like to see more collaborations where you bring the art and the science together, where you bring the poetry and the physics together. We need to have more artists and physicists talking to each other versus just having engineering. Like, STEM is great, but we got to throw a couple of A's in there as well. We do need the STEAM, right? We do have to have the artists, the creators. It's good for perspective. It's good for the aesthetic of being an individual, and I think style matters. Style still matters to a lot of us. Otherwise, I mean, Range Rover just released their sales figures this year. They have doubled the amount of Range Rovers sold in America. Now, that could be a factor of the amount of people that are actually capable of buying an expensive car, but I also think it has a lot to do with the fact that style still means something, right? The way that we identify with the world still means something. And this is the key consideration for AI, is that AI needs to be also part of the human experience. Just
Yeah.
because we're talking about artificial experience doesn't mean we have to have an artificial style either. In fact, you wrote really eloquently about this during the week. Anybody who's listening to this, I highly recommend you find Chris's article on this particular topic, which is kind of a rebuttal, if you will, to a TED talk that was given about this new digital species, right? This idea that we're creating a new digital species. You came back at that pretty hard. So tell us a little bit about what you think about a new digital species.
So I thank you, Richard. I remember watching the TED Talks. So last week we had a lot of TED recordings. This one was from Microsoft's new AI chief executive, Mustafa Suleiman. And for some context, he was one of the co-founders of Google DeepMind. He left Google DeepMind. He founded a company called Inflection. And Microsoft since acqui-hired in Inflection, and he's now their head of AI. And so this is someone who is super experienced that I have tremendous respect for in terms of what he has done for the AI space. If you haven't read his book, The Coming Wave, it's highly recommended. And while I loved his talk at a certain level, I found that there were things that he said that I fundamentally disagreed with. And one was this metaphor that he encouraged us to use of thinking about AI as a sort of digital species. And the first concern that I had with that is one, it was a distraction. For you to be a species, you really need some sort of autonomy and self direction, which he clearly articulated that he wasn't encouraging for AI. He thought that was dangerous for AI to have. And so I think it's more of just nice words to say that end up distract us from the big issues around literacy and accessibility that
Yeah,
we need to focus on today in the short term for AI. If we're looking to have AI benefit the majority of people, I think it's important that we don't get sidetracked by lofty descriptions of what AI could be. And AI certainly can be all of this, but what is it today? And I think fundamentally today we need to be clear when we're talking about AI that this is a tool, it's a technology. It's not going to save us
yeah,
from ourselves or from the world. Maybe one day it can evolve to that, but today people are in charge and people need to make smart decisions. People need to learn about this technology and they need to integrate it into their businesses. But elevating it beyond that of a tool, I think is misguided. The second thing that he brought up, he spoke about how in the past unlocking economic growth meant that we needed to capture people, and you had slavery, or you built factories, or you struck oil and you destroyed the planet. And again, true to a lot of degrees, but then he started saying AI was something we're building from scratch, and it was again this promised land. And I said clearly he was glossing over the fact that AI is built upon the data and private content of a lot of creators and artists and
hmm
writers. And a lot of that was stolen and it was used without permission. And so,
yeah,
how do you reconcile with that when the very people whose data you're using, you're probably going to displace them from a job? And we're not having conversations about compensation and how we need to ensure that you have provenance and copyright protections for artists and for creators. So I loved his talk, but I do think it's important that we contextualize this as a part of a conversation.
yeah.
It's worthwhile for more people like myself to weigh in and say, this is how we think about it, or this is why we should not only look at it like this, but we need to have this perspective.
Yeah, I really like that perspective. I love that you are willing to put your perspective out there and have an opinion that is maybe counter to kind of the tech bro attitude towards AI right now. I've been fortunate enough that I've been talking to a lot of leaders over the last several weeks. I've been talking to product leaders, engineering leaders, and design leaders, and asking them specifically how they see AI entering into the space. And I think what I'm hearing is after that initial fear, anxiety, and excitement, or maybe a little bit of hubris, even, we've now started to, at least lead the leaders that I've been talking to, have now settled into a much more realistic set of expectations.
Yeah.
They know that a lot of these LLMs, these models, are pretty static. They require a significant amount of training. They require a significant amount of data input. They are not perfect. They make mistakes. They are very, very difficult to take from the model level and turn into an application.
Yep.
It's extremely difficult to make them into a product. So I think what a lot of the product leaders that I'm speaking to have now tasted the medicine, and they realize that, well, it's quite bitter, and that there is, although a lovely promise on the horizon, there's also a reality that it's the medicine is going to take a little while to go down, and it's not going to be as delicious as they thought. So it actually reminds me, I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Yesterday, which is a story about a guy who essentially experiences that there's a global blackout. He gets hit by a bus. He wakes up, and he's the only one in the whole world who remembers any of the Beatles songs. And so he starts writing them down and performing them. And it's a little bit like that. I think the initial excitement of listening to that music by Jack Mallock, everybody's rallying around him. They say he's a genius. But then over time, everybody starts to realize, actually, this probably, or at least he reveals to everybody is that, he isn't the author of this stuff. He stole these ideas from John Lennon and Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr and George Harrison. And I think that's the truth here, is that everything that we build is derivative. Everything is contextually from somewhere else. Even if it is original art, even if it is original AI, it's built on infrastructure and content and data that was produced on, at the risk of sounding, um, too political here, on the backs of slaves.
Yeah.
A lot of this stuff was built on the backs of people who didn't really have a choice. And so
Yeah.
now, we have to be realistic about it. This is a podcast about AI, but it's also a podcast about how AI touches lives and the reality that's facing it. So you and I are both optimists when it comes to AI, but we're also optimists with a very, very serious dose of reality, because we know that we've been around the block before. We've seen crypto, we've seen the internet, we've seen financial crises. We're old enough to understand that these things, as much as we'd love to believe they're all rainbows and unicorns, the reality is it comes at a cost. And one of the
Exactly.
things that I think we can kind of round up today's conversation with is maybe just talking a little bit about the companies that are making investments, companies that are thinking about the infrastructure. They're also being incredibly highly valued. We saw a significant amount of investments being made over the last couple of weeks. I think the last one that I saw, $175 million investment at a $2 billion valuation for a company that's 2 years old and doesn't even have a product yet.
Yeah.
We're in a bubble. We have to be realistic about this. How long and what can we expect if we are going to be investing in this as product managers, product leaders, as product creators? What can we expect the cycle to look like over the next couple of years?
So I think this is a great place for us to run the conversation on. And what I'll start with is an example of Adobe, because AI is this technology that is very nascent. And to your point, we have made missteps. We
Mm-hmm.
still need to figure out what this looks like from an application standpoint. And one of the interesting things that Adobe brings to the table is that they're investing in the technology. They released new Firefly image models this week, but you're also seeing where they're being very thoughtful as to how they implement their AI into actual products and tools. And
Mm-hmm.
so it's one thing when you're just going to a model and you're saying, "Hey, come up with this image for me," or "Come up with this song for me." And it's a different thing when you have a piece of art you're working on and you need to change the aspect ratio, and AI can then be used within your tool to expand the canvas, change the aspect ratio. It's a
Mm-hmm.
different sort of mindset that the artist is in or the creator is in when AI is being used as this tool to augment what they're doing.
Right.
You're seeing this week they announced things like style kits, where if you have a brand, you have a product, you can define certain restrictions and requirements, and AI can be used to monitor that. So there are certain colors that you need to use if the product needs to be
Yeah.
placed in a certain
Super
environment.
useful. Really,
Exactly.
really highly, highly
Right.
applicable. Yeah.
And so you're starting to see where companies that have that experience building products are able to flex that muscle and deliver actual results. And that brings me to the valuation that we're seeing with some of the startups. it's a big risk that we're taking. The one company that I want to start with is Cognition. And I bring them up for two reasons. One, just a couple weeks ago, Cognition raised $21 million for their Series A. And I believe they were valued at $350 million.
Mm,
Less than a month later, this company is
yeah,
now valued at $2 billion, and they have raised an additional $175 million. Like,
right.
that is crazy. So either the investors saw something that made them think, wow, a month later this is completely undervalued, or we're in a massive bubble and it's going to burst and they're going to be left holding a serious bag. Because of course we saw criticism of Devin come out from developers that looked at what it was doing, dissected it, and
Hmm.
said, well, it's great, but it's not that great, right? But apparently Founders Fund is doubling down on this investment, and a month later this company is now worth $2 billion.
Yeah, I mean, it does from the outside look a little bit like those, as you said, that's specifically the VC investors. So let's just pick on them for a second. They lucked out with crypto, and now they are hedging their bets in AI.
Yeah,
I think what we also have to be absolutely clear about is that VC is actually not the biggest investor in AI by a long stretch. Microsoft alone has invested more money in AI than all of the venture capitalists put together, all of them.
yeah.
So what
Microsoft
we're seeing,
and Nvidia has also been investing a lot in AI startups.
yeah, and so what we're seeing is something quite unusual. We're seeing not only VC investments, but we're seeing an institutional level investment, a corporate investment in a technology, which I kind of like. I like the idea that a company is making choices about their P&L and their
Mhm.
balance sheet as to how they're going to spend the money. These are internally motivated ideas on like what to do with our treasury. I can imagine what the Microsoft treasury looks like and what the Apple treasury looks like. It's probably significant. And they're thinking, well, what do we do with this? Right. And that's a very different incentive than if you've got an external board of GPs from VCs telling you what to do. It's a very, very different conversation. So I
Sure.
think the distinction we need to make here is what is happening in the world of institutional slash corporate investment, where these companies are not only incentivized to make a return on that investment, but also have the operational control to deliver on that promise, versus those startups that are essentially betting on, it's gambling. They're betting on something that they have not yet created yet. I think that your example of Adobe is perfect. Here is a company with a treasury, with a lot of understanding of who their market is, a captive audience, and they can take this technology and they can immediately start feeding it to their users. Like, users is a terrible name, their constituents, and saying like, look, here is something that we've created. Go and find out if this is useful to you, and they can have that relationship. It's very different from a startup that has not yet created product market fit, does
Mhm.
not have an audience that they can even test with, doesn't even have a proxy that they can test with. And so
Yeah.
I think there are a lot of distinctions here, and it's easy for us. We're not investors, and we're not advisors, and this is not investment advice. But those of you who do listen to this and think about these things, it is important to make those distinctions between the companies themselves that are making investments in themselves, in their customers, versus those that are on the bandwagon saying, "Hey, we put AI at the end of our dot, something," and now we're an AI company.
Yeah, and to that point, one thing I'll add, if you think of like the Nvidias and the Microsoft and the Amazons and the Googles of the world, their investment, as I touched on earlier, is double dipping. And so when
Mm-hmm.
you have them invest in an AI startup, that startup has to come back and use their infrastructure likely, because why
Oh
would
yeah.
you use somebody else's infrastructure? And so it's a smart bet on their end to be like, hey, you know what? You want to invest in doing this research and innovation? Sure, we'll invest and you'll end up using our infrastructure. And so that's actually pretty good on their end. The other story that I'll wrap up with is Elon Musk's xAI. So xAI
Mm-hmm.
is a company founded by Elon Musk last year to compete against the bigger research AI labs like OpenAI and Anthropic, because he believed that they became too profit focused and they were being distracted from the AI that he had envisioned when he co-founded OpenAI, which
Mm-hmm.
was supposed to be maximally beneficial. And so he founded xAI. And what's really impressive is that one, xAI has delivered very quickly in terms of releasing models, open sourcing certain models, and differentiating themselves. But they're looking to raise $6 billion at an $18 billion valuation. Again, we're talking about
Nuts.
companies that haven't yet, as you said, really created product market fit. Like, okay, so you have made this AI, you still need to productize this technology, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, again, you're seeing investors gamble a lot here where they're thinking he'll be able to deliver or the company will be able to deliver. But this is the nature of the game with AI right now.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a really interesting space. We've got the big seven companies that are essentially 30 to 30 something percent of the S&P.
Hmm.
They are significantly valued right now, maybe even overvalued slightly. It's a really interesting time. Uh, it's also a good time to prepare for the other side of this, right? We've been here before. Um, you know, be prepared.
Yeah.
Take an anti-fragile approach to your portfolio. Take an anti-fragile approach to your business. If you're a startup, think about what's going to happen in a year or two when the heat is off, when the bubble has burst. So yeah, really interested. I think that's a really good place to end. Chris, this was a much more interesting conversation than we've had in the past because we're not just reviewing the news; we're actually like getting into the weeds of it. Thank you so much for your time. I'm always, always, always impressed by your thinking. For those of you who are listening, take a look at maginative.com. We get into the weeds in the articles there. You can subscribe to a weekly update. It'll include this conversation, and then of course we've got interviews with leaders that are being released on a regular basis as well, so you can hear from them, hear their perspectives. And we have a paid subscription as well, which will give you a deep dive into this. Highly recommended. We're doing this for we don't get any revenue directly from this yet. So please support us. Please subscribe. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Until next time, one love.